My name is Garret Kane. I'm a sculptor, animator, writer, and co-founder of the climate art tech company Ecosapiens. In this first long-form video, I'll take you through the techniques and processes I used to create this piece, a commissioned sculpture made from wire, roots, ceramic, epoxy clay, synthetic flowers, and patinas. This sculpture was made entirely by hand, but in future videos, we'll explore my 3D workflow, both bringing physical work into digital and translating digital into physical. We'll dive into metal plating, crystal growing, and every other technique I use to bring my art to life. I'm excited to get started, and I hope you'll find something useful here. And also, I'll link every product and material I use below. Every project begins with a pencil and paper, the fastest way to map the mind. For this piece, my sketch was super rough, just something to reference in the background for proportions, since it had odd proportions. I found this wood in New York City. It's used to block off construction and pipe work. I had a few slabs lying around, so I cut some chunks to use as quick wood bases. That said, the base is something that should be considered carefully. It's like the frame of a painting. It could completely change the feel and the perceived value of a piece. To start, I used armature wire to block out the initial form. This is similar to how you'd begin a traditional oil clay sculpture, but instead of filling it in with aluminum foil and clay, these lines will act as the actual structure of the piece. I'll build off of them using different wire thicknesses for variety. The key here is to focus on the overall form, blocking out sections like the shoulders, quads, lats, while constantly referencing the sketch. One trick, I use scrap wire I had lying around, but if I were starting from scratch, I'd go to Home Depot and pick up a few different thicknesses of copper wire. It's by far the cheapest option I've found. As I continue building the form, I'm using more wire to block out broad shapes, bending it until it looks right. For bonding, I'm using CA, cyanoacrylate glue, medium thickness, along with an activator. Warning, this stuff is toxic, so you'll need a fan for ventilation, but it dries instantly, making it by far the fastest way I've found to work. I'll link a large bottle of CA glue I use below. As a quick safety note, be careful not to touch the glue when you spray it with your activator. It won't burn you, but it feels like it does, and trust me, it hurts like hell. If you want a non-toxic alternative, hot glue or UV reactive glue can work, but as much as I'd love to use something else, nothing comes close to matching the speed and strength of CA glue and activator. Fun fact, CA, or crazy glue, was originally invented during the Vietnam War to seal wounds. That's why it sticks to your skin so well. It was literally designed to, and I don't like to use the word literally. Now I start integrating branches into the wire structure. This helps break up the shapes and creates that fusion of natural and artificial elements that I'm going for. I cut the branches into smaller pieces, then glue and tie them onto the main form, still focusing on blocking out large shapes at this stage. This step is all about layering and building structure while keeping an eye on the overall form. Stick hunt. When looking for branches, the ideal pieces are kind of complex and delicate, but it all depends on your region. Where I am in upstate New York, most native species tend to be pretty straight branches, so the best source I've found for complex shapes is overturned tree stumps. If you find a good one, bring some clippers, and it's kind of like mining for gold. You can uncover intricate, beautiful root structures that can add so much character very quickly to a piece, like these. Building form and detail. Now it's all about blocking in more form with the roots and branches, building out the larger, bulkier sections of the body and musculature while also incorporating finer details like these vein root hybrid structures. One interesting aspect of this process is that form and detail develop almost simultaneously, which isn't typical for most traditional paintings or sculptures. It can make it more difficult. As I work, I constantly rotate the piece, checking the weight and positioning of each limb. I lean back, squint my eyes often. This helps me see it as a blurry shape, focusing on the overall composition rather than getting lost in small details too early in the process. All the while, I'm using CA glue and activator to keep the process moving quickly. Strengthening the structure. This next phase is where the piece starts to gain real structural strength. Up until now, adjusting the form has been relatively easy since CA glue only forms a weak bond between metal and wood. Now we'll introduce two-part epoxy clay. There are plenty of great options, and I'll link the one I use below. To activate it, we'll mix the two components in equal parts, twisting and mashing them together until they become one uniform color. I use this epoxy clay to sort of cap, quote unquote, the connection points, sealing glued areas to make them permanent. I also roll the clay into tube-like forms to build up additional structure. Once hardened, it becomes extremely strong, reinforcing the entire. One major bonus, epoxy clay has excellent adhesive properties. If you wet it slightly with water and really press it into the material, it bonds well on its own. So that said, for speed, sometimes still I'll add a little CA glue as I apply it. Important note, keep the clay relatively warm or it will become too hard to work with. Keep all your materials warm. If they get cold, it sucks. Okay. This part, resin reinforcement. Next, to fully lock in and reinforce the armature, I'll use a 2-part resin. There are eco-friendlier options available, but for this project, I used an old one I had left over. I'll link a good one below. Resin tip, for a project like this, where we aren't pouring resin, which is its own complicated thing, I recommend laminating resin. It tends to drip less. Also, ventilation is key. Most resins are toxic unless you use aqua resin, which is a great non-toxic alternative. And the resin before mixing. A heat gun, hair dryer, space heater, aimed at the bottles for a bit will help. Mix them well, heat it again, then brush it on. This is the final step in reinforcing the armature. And honestly, this part's optional. It does add extra strength and durability, if you feel it's needed. Okay, so this next part, I'm using a metallic paint that contains real metal so that when you spray the patina on, it reacts and changes color. I actually lost the original footage of this step. Either I forgot to record it or I deleted it, who knows. So I filmed this little time lapse to show the process and the products I use. I've tested a lot of brands and Sculpt Nouveau is generally my favorite. Now, as you'll notice, my paint looks extremely chunky and sandy. That's because, as I said before, my new office has no insulation and it dropped below freezing, ruining a lot of my specialty paints. So this would normally go on much smoother. So like I said, if you live somewhere cold, don't let your goddamn studio freeze because it sucks. Fortunately, the chemical reaction still works. It just doesn't apply smooth. Now, you can see the base layer of paint I applied. It's a darker bronze-based paint that turns green when patinaed. For the top layer, I used a brass-based paint, which develops into a beautiful bright green patina. Oh, sorry, blue or green, whatever. Lastly, at this stage, I often metal plate the work, but due to time and temperature constraints, I opted for this simpler technique. It's still a fantastic effect and gives the sculpture a strong metallic finish, but obviously metal plating is a little cooler. Creating the outer structure. For the outer portions, there are many ways to approach it. You could 3D print them, though getting the scale right can be tricky. From there, you can paint or metal plate those parts. For this one, I chose ceramics, simple shapes to block out the major muscle groups, because I knew I wanted that gold luster finish. I blocked out the general shapes and simply attached them to the armature. I sculpted everything by hand using just a knife and a few basic tools. I wanted this to feel kind of crude with a hand-sculpted feel, something rough. It was intentionally done that way. Firing the clay and applying the luster. Once the ceramic pieces are sculpted, it's time to fire the clay. Step 1. Bisque firing, the first fire. Let the clay dry for several days, especially if you're in a more humid region. Always fire the first pass on slow. This is called a slow bisque. Firing follows a basic system called cones, which is just a measurement of heat. The lowest temperature you're ever really going to fire at is cone 015, which is like 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. And the highest is cone 10, around 2400. For this project, I'm bisque firing at cone 04. This initial firing takes about 10 hours for heating and cooling, and I think it costs around $20 in electricity, depending on your location. So once it's fired and cooled, this next part is the glazing. So once bisque fired, it's time to apply the glaze. In this case, I'm using a canary yellow glaze at cone 05, so a little hotter. Applying 3 coats, letting each layer dry before adding the next. When firing glaze, you always go slightly hotter so the clay remains porous, allowing the glazes, melting glass and minerals to fuse into the surface. And then step 3, the gold luster, the final fire. Again, a note, luster's super toxic. Wear a mask, gloves, and use ventilation. If it touches your skin, it will discolor the surface when you fire it. The surface must be completely oil-free. Any contamination will ruin it, really. So you fire luster at cone 019, so that's the coldest of all. The result is a thin coat of real gold, permanently melted into the outer glass layer of the glaze. And the best part is that this luxurious effect is incredibly affordable. A few pennies of clay, maybe $1 of glaze, and maybe 10 gold luster for everything I used. So for just a few dollars, you get beautiful real gold details. All right, getting toward the end, attaching the final details. Next, I break the selenite, which was actually the original inspiration for the giant forearms of this piece. Now it's time to attach all the major details. The gold ceramic pieces are first glued using the CA glue for an instant bond. Then I reinforce them with this stuff E6000, a super strong but I think extremely toxic glue from Home Depot. Finally, I use epoxy clay to seamlessly connect everything, blending the materials into a cohesive structure. This step brings everything together, locking in the form, textures, and materials into the final piece. Documentation, photographing the work. Now it's time to document the sculpture. One of the most important steps, you'll need lights. Cheap but effective options are available on Amazon or anywhere. A solid backdrop. This is especially important for complex pieces. Choose backgrounds that contrast with the colors of the work. Then spend a few hours experimenting with your lights or however long you need. Taking photos and videos of the piece. Newer iPhones work decently well, but if you want a truly professional look, you'll need a real camera, SLR or whatever. Personally, I use my iPhone, but if it's for a show or something really important, sometimes I hire a photographer. I usually edit them myself. You know, as a sculptor, this part is way more important than you might think because like 99.9% repeating of people who see your work are going to experience it digitally. So without good documentation, the piece won't have the same impact it does in real life. It's just an unfortunate truth, and it's a pain in the ass, but has to happen. Okay, we're not done yet. Shipping the work. Last, we have to pack the sculpture. First, use something soft and pliable, like cling wrap. Make small balls and fill every possible gap between the arms, legs, and any delicate areas. Then wrap the entire piece in cling wrap, layer by layer, filling gaps with more material until it becomes a solid mast. Next, move on to bubble wrap or paper wrap. I prefer this kind of little more eco-friendly paper wrap, which is recycled and biodegradable. That said, you have to work with what's available and consider costs. I'll link this paper wrap below. Once it's fully wrapped, place it in a box that's extremely snug. Rule number 1 of packing sculptures: movement is what breaks them. The piece should fit so tightly that you kind of have to press down on the top as you tape it shut. Then you want to double box it, so wrap the first box in another layer of protection, or you could use packing peanuts or whatever. But the key is no movement. So the box, inside the box, can't move either. Then that's it, ship it. So final thoughts. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey. I'll be posting more content soon, including material reviews, product tests, eco-friendly art techniques, art, science, and climate tech stories I find interesting, and more work. So stay tuned. I guess that's it then. Okay.